Paris was asleep under a blanket of fog the night it began. The lamps along the Seine burned like tired eyes, their yellow halos fading into the mist. Somewhere beyond the Pont Neuf, a man walked alone, his footsteps echoing like the slow ticking of a clock running out of time. He carried no umbrella, no purpose, and yet there was something deliberate in his stride, as if he knew where the story would end before it had even begun. By morning, the man would be dead, and the note found in his pocket would make Inspector Moreau question the very notion of chance itself. They said he had predicted his own murder, that he had walked into the night knowing precisely when and how it would come. The newspapers, hungry for sensation, printed the phrase "the man who knew the future" in bold letters across the front page. But Moreau, standing in the drizzle outside the morgue, felt no thrill in the mystery, only a chill deeper than the rain, a weight pressing against his chest. There was something about this case that didn't belong to reason alone. It smelled faintly of obsession, of a man's quiet descent into the shadows of his own prophecy. If you're drawn to these dark and human corners of the old world, to mysteries steeped in fog, memory, and the trembling pulse of fate, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, each one written by hand, researched with care, and told in the language of another time. And now let us walk with Inspector Moreau through the wet streets of Paris into a story that refuses to stay buried. The fog that morning had the weight of wet linen, heavy and close against the skin. It rolled down from the roofs, clung to the narrow alleys, and settled along the river where the current moved sluggishly beneath the stone arches of the Pont Neuf. The first light of day had not yet burned through the mist, and the city seemed to breathe in slow, uncertain sighs, a grey half-world between night and morning. From somewhere upriver came the dull clang of a barge chain, then the rasp of a broom against cobblestone. The rest was silence, the kind that carries the echo of unseen footsteps. Inspector Moreau arrived just before 7. His collar was turned up against the chill, his pipe unlit between his fingers. The call had come less than an hour before. A body had been found by a fisherman beneath the bridge, face down in the shallows, coat still buttoned as if for a walk. The police cordon was barely in place when Moreau stepped under the arch, his shoes crunching over damp grit. A constable saluted him, the gesture half lost in the fog. "The name's Bellard, André Bellard," said the young officer, handing over a folded wallet. "No struggle, no wounds, nothing stolen. The doctor says the lungs are full of river water, so he drowned. But... Moreau's voice was calm, gravelled by sleep and tobacco. "There was this." The constable held out a small envelope, its edges warped by moisture. Moreau took it carefully. The paper was thin, foreign in texture, and inside was a single telegram slip. The ink, though blurred, was legible. "To André Bellard, Paris from, unknown, montages delivered, yesterday, 6 p.m. Content: tomorrow at 7 in the morning you will die by the river." For a long moment the inspector said nothing. The fog swirled faintly around the words, as if the air itself were listening. Then he folded the telegram back into the envelope and tucked it into his coat. "Was it sent to his home?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Lodgings on Rue du Cherche-Midi. He lived alone." Moreau nodded absently. The name Montargis rang somewhere distant in his mind. A quiet provincial town, 3 hours by train, where nothing remarkable ever happened. Yet the telegram had been stamped and delivered through official channels. Someone had used the machinery of the state to announce a death that came precisely as foretold. He looked down at the man stretched upon the cobbles. Bellard's hair was thinning at the crown, his moustache neatly trimmed, his hands soft. A clerk's hands. The face, pale and swollen from the water, bore no sign of fear, only a strange composure, as if he had surrendered willingly to the river. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no torn buttons, not even mud on the trousers. He might have lain down there himself and let the tide claim him. The river lapped faintly at the stones, whispering against the boots of the attendants as they lifted the stretcher. Moreau watched until the white sheet was drawn over the man's face. Something about the scene unsettled him, not its violence, for there was none, but its precision. It felt rehearsed, as though the act had been staged to fit the telegram's cruel promise. By mid-morning, the Quai des Orfèvres smelled of damp wool and over-brewed coffee. Moreau stood by the window in his office, staring through the mist that still veiled the city. His assistant, Janvier, entered quietly with a folder and placed it on the desk. Bellard André, age 42, born in Lyon. Former accountant, dismissed from the Banque de la République 5 months ago. Since then, he's been living modestly in a furnished room on Rue du Cherche-Midi. Landlady says he kept to himself. No visitors, no debts she knew of. Family? Divorced. Wife lives in Saint-Aubin, according to the file. Moreau's eyes flickered toward the telegram resting beside his papers. And the origin? The clerk in Montages confirmed the stamp, but says no one remembers sending it. The entry in the ledger's missing. Could be a false report, or someone bribed the operator. Someone who wanted this death to be seen as destiny, Moreau murmured. Janvier looked uncertain. A coincidence, perhaps? Moreau smiled faintly, though without warmth. Coincidences are convenient, my friend. But men who predict their own deaths are rare. He took his coat once more and stepped out into the grey light of late morning. The streets smelled of wet stone and horse dung, of bread cooling in the bakeries. As he walked toward the river, he tried to imagine Bellard's last evening, the telegram arriving at his door, the tremor in his hand as he read it, the decision to keep walking into the night. Did he believe the message, or had belief been forced upon him by the hour itself? At the scene once more, the river seemed less menacing in daylight, almost tranquil. Children were feeding pigeons near the steps, and the world had resumed its indifferent rhythm. Yet for Moreau, something remained suspended, as if time had not quite advanced since dawn. He crouched where Bellard's body had lain, noting the angle of the current, the slope of the embankment, the faint trail in the mud where a shoe had slipped. Everything pointed to a quiet surrender, not a struggle. He rose, lit his pipe, and exhaled slowly. The smoke curled upward and vanished into the mist. There was a taste of metal in the air. The river's breath mingled with the scent of iron from the bridge. And in that silence, Moreau thought he heard the faint echo of a man's footsteps, measured and calm, descending toward the water. That evening, in his small apartment overlooking the Boulevard Saint-Germain, he poured himself a glass of brandy and opened his notebook. The lamplight trembled against the page. He wrote in his tight, deliberate hand, Case André Bellard, found drowned beneath Pont-Neuf. Telegram predicting death received prior. Source, Montages. Motive, unclear. Hypothesis, premeditation by victim, or orchestration by unknown party. He paused, tapping the pen against his lip. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. From the street below came the hum of a passing tram, the murmur of voices, the low whistle of a newspaper boy calling the evening edition. He imagined tomorrow's headline, "The Man Who Knew the Future," and felt a dull irritation. The press would make a spectacle of it before the truth was even known. He turned the page and began sketching a timeline. The telegram had been delivered at 6 in the evening. The death occurred roughly 13 hours later. If Bellard had left his apartment around dawn, it meant he had gone willingly, perhaps even on schedule. Moreau underlined the word schedule and leaned back. What sort of man kept an appointment with death? Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady. He opened the window slightly, letting in the smell of wet stone. His eyes drifted to the street lamp below, its light refracted through the rain like a coin flickering in water. Somewhere in the back of his mind the question returned, insistent as the dripping from the eaves. Had the man believed the telegram, or had he simply obeyed it? When he finally closed his notebook, it was past midnight. The city had grown still again, the kind of stillness that seems to listen. He blew out the lamp and stood for a while in the darkness, watching the faint reflection of rain on the window pane. Somewhere beyond the river, a church bell tolled once, marking the hour. And though Moreau would never admit it, he found himself counting the seconds after, waiting, almost unwillingly, for something else to happen. The next morning, a telegram awaited him on his desk. It bore no signature, only 5 words. "The river remembers the hour." He read it twice, then folded it carefully, his hand steady, but his pulse quickening. The mystery had begun to breathe. The rain had softened to a fine mist by the time Inspector Moreau reached Rue Saint-Aubin. The narrow street seemed untouched by the rush of the modern world, as though time itself had forgotten this small corner of Paris. The houses leaned toward each other like old conspirators, their shutters half closed, their windows breathing out faint warmth from within. Somewhere nearby, a clock chimed 11, a sound that arrived muffled, as if travelling through sleep. He found the house easily. The landlady had described it with such precision that he could have drawn it. 2 stories, yellow facade faded to the colour of bone, a rusted balcony whose flowers had long since withered. The door opened before he could knock twice. A woman stood there, tall, slender, dressed in black, though it was not yet morning attire. Her eyes were grey, the kind that never quite settled on the present moment. "You must be Inspector Moreau," she said. Her voice was quiet, but without tremor. "You've come about André?" He inclined his head. "May I come in, Madame Bellard?" She stepped aside, motioning him into a parlour whose air still carried the faint trace of perfume. Not fresh, but old, clinging to the drapes like a memory reluctant to fade. The furnishings were modest, a walnut cabinet, a clock that had stopped at some forgotten hour, a photograph in a silver frame upon the mantel. Moreau noticed it at once. A younger version of her, smiling beside a man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to be looking past the camera. "My husband," she said, noticing his glance. "Or rather, my former husband. We divorced 4 years ago." Moreau remained standing, his hat in his hands. "Did you have any contact since?" "Occasionally," she replied, sitting gracefully upon the edge of the sofa. "Letters. Once or twice he came to visit. He always seemed elsewhere, like a man translating thoughts that belonged to another language." "Was he ill?" "Not in the body, but he was not well. He had become preoccupied with strange ideas. That time could be measured differently, that some men were born with a defect in their hours. He would speak of moments repeating themselves, of the future slipping into the present. I used to think it was the drink, but he never drank enough for madness." Moreau studied her face. She spoke with neither affection nor contempt, only with the careful neutrality of someone describing a wound long scarred over. "Did he ever mention receiving messages or predictions?" Her eyes flickered for the first time. "You've found one of them, haven't you?" He said nothing. She rose and crossed the room, opening a drawer in the cabinet. From within she drew a small bundle of papers tied with ribbon. "He sent me these. I kept them because I couldn't quite bring myself to throw them away. The first one came 3 years ago. It said I would meet a stranger who would alter my life. A month later, I met a man from Lille, a bookseller, who proposed within the year. The next letter predicted that the marriage would never happen. It didn't." She placed the letters on the table. The handwriting was the same as on the telegram, neat, measured, almost mechanical in its rhythm. Each note bore a date and a brief line foretelling something small but precise, a letter arriving, a storm breaking, a dream recurring. Did you ever answer him? Once. I asked him why he wrote such things. He replied that he was only transcribing what he had already seen. Moreau turned one of the letters over, noticing the faint watermark of the same montages paper as the telegram. The pattern was unmistakable, a small embossed crest of an oak leaf. When did you last hear from him? 2 weeks ago. And what did he say? She hesitated. That the hour was approaching, that he would soon prove what no man had ever proved before. I thought it was another of his delusions. The clock on the mantel ticked once, a sudden sharp sound that made both of them glance toward it. Then silence returned. Madame Bellard, Moreau said softly, did your husband ever speak of ending his life? Her face hardened. No, he feared death too much to meet it willingly. That's what makes all this impossible. He looked at her for a moment, weighing the contradiction between her composure and the faint tremor at her wrist. Then he rose. I may need to return. If you think of anything, any name, any letter you've not shown me, please send word to the Quai des Orfèvres. She nodded, but her gaze had drifted toward the rain-streaked window. As he turned to leave, she said quietly, Inspector, do you believe a man can truly see what's coming? Moreau paused in the doorway. I believe a man can convince himself of almost anything, especially if he wishes it deeply enough. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained far away. Then perhaps André believed too well. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and chimney smoke. Moreau walked slowly down the street, his thoughts circling the same point, like moths around a lamp. The woman's calm unsettled him. There was no grief in her, only an odd patience, as if she too had been expecting the telegram's fulfillment. At the corner, he stopped beneath the awning of a cafe. Inside, the proprietor was polishing glasses, indifferent to the drizzle beyond the window. Moreau ordered a small coffee and unfolded his notebook once more. Letters predicting minor events matching the tone of the death telegram. All written on montages paper. He underlined the word montages twice. There was a rhythm to it now, a pattern repeating through the fog. As he sipped, he replayed the widow's words. He believed time could be measured differently. It reminded him of something an old professor once said, that obsession is the slowest kind of suicide, the kind that rewrites the hours until nothing remains but the final act. The street had grown quieter. The rain drew thin, silvery lines down the cafe window. Somewhere beyond, a child was singing a tune to no one. Moreau finished his coffee and rose, slipping a few francs beneath the cup. As he stepped back into the open air, a sound stopped him, the faint, metallic tick of a clock striking noon. And yet, when he looked at the street's clock tower, its hands still pointed to 11. That evening, back at his office, Janvier was waiting with a telegram slip. Came 15 minutes ago, Chief, from the same montages office. Moreau took it slowly, his eyes narrowing. To Inspector Moreau, Paris, from unknown, montages content. You will visit the widow again, she will lie. For a long while he said nothing. Then he folded the telegram neatly, placed it beside the others, and lit his pipe. The room filled with smoke, curling and twisting like thought itself. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile playing at the edge of his lips. So, he murmured, the future has turned its gaze toward me. Outside, the fog thickened once more, and the bells of the city began their slow, uncertain toll. The telegraph office in Montages sat at the corner of the main square, opposite a fountain that had not worked since the war. Its windows were smeared with dust, the glass clouded by years of unwashed breath and smoke. The brass plaque beside the door read Postes et Telegraphes, though the letters had faded to a dull grey. Inside, the air was dry with the scent of paper and ink, a place where time itself seemed to have slowed to the ticking of the wall clock above the counter. Inspector Moreau arrived just after noon, his overcoat still damp from the train journey. He had spent the morning staring out at the passing countryside, a blur of wet fields, half-bare orchards, and distant church spires dissolving into fog. Montargis appeared exactly as he remembered from a forgotten case years ago, provincial, polite, and steeped in silence. The kind of town where nothing unexpected ever happened, until it did. A bell jingled faintly as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with round spectacles and an expression of mild irritation, as though the interruption of routine were in itself an inconvenience. "Inspector Moreau, Paris," he said, showing his identification. "I'm here about a telegram sent from this office 2 days ago to a Monsieur André Bellart." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. 2 days ago? There were several. I'd need the number. It bore no number. It was signed by no one. The man's brow furrowed. Impossible. All telegrams are numbered. Moreau placed the folded slip upon the counter. The clerk bent over it, tracing the words with a cautious finger. The ink was faint, but the postmark clear. Montargis, 6 p.m. The man's colour drained slightly. "Curious," he murmured. "The stamp is ours, but this handwriting, it's not mine, nor any of the staff's." "You're certain?" He nodded, pulling a thick ledger from beneath the counter. The pages smelled of ink and tobacco. "Each message is logged by the hour. Let's see. 6 o'clock, day before yesterday." He ran a finger down the columns. "Ah, there's a gap here. 5:55, message to Orléans. Next entry, 6:15, notice to Paris, nothing between." "Could it have been removed?" The clerk frowned. "No one touches these ledgers except me." Moreau's eyes flicked to the door that led into the back room. "How many employees work here?" 3, not counting myself. 1 on the counter, 1 messenger, 1 night clerk." "Where are they?" "Home, most likely. There's hardly enough traffic for all of us at once." Moreau leaned closer, his voice lowering. "Did anyone ask to use the telegraph privately? Someone you didn't know, perhaps claiming official business?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "There was a gentleman. Late evening, I was just closing. He said he represented the Ministry of Interior. Showed papers I didn't quite have time to read. He insisted the message was urgent. Paid in cash, in exact change. When I asked for a name, he only said, 'The future will sign it.'" Moreau's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "Describe him." "Tall, pale, clean-shaven, spoke softly as if rehearsed, wore a dark coat, foreign cut, I'd say." "Foreign?" "Not the tailoring you find here, too precise." The inspector folded the telegram once more and slipped it into his pocket. "If he returns, you will send word to the prefecture immediately." The clerk nodded, visibly relieved. "You think it's criminal, then?" "I think," Moreau replied, "someone is playing a game with time, and games of that sort rarely end well." Outside, the afternoon light had turned thin and metallic. The square was nearly empty, a woman carrying bread, a boy chasing a hoop, a stray dog nosing through puddles. The town's church bell tolled distantly, its echo stretching over the roofs like a sigh. Moreau walked slowly toward the café opposite the station and took a seat by the window. He ordered a coffee and unbuttoned his coat. The fire, in the small stove near the counter, crackled softly. From his pocket he drew the telegram again, smoothing the creases. It looked harmless now, absurd even, like a prank played by some faceless jester. Yet a man had drowned because of it, or because he believed it. He tried to imagine the unknown sender sitting at the telegraph key, tapping out each word with deliberate care. "Tomorrow at 7 in the morning, you will die by the river." It had the structure of a prophecy, but the tone of a command. And the missing ledger entry, that too was a kind of silence, a deliberate erasure. Someone wanted this message to appear as though it had passed through official hands while leaving no trace of its author. The waiter brought his coffee. Moreau thanked him absently and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness clear his thoughts. Across the street, an old man was feeding pigeons from a bench, scattering crumbs that vanished as soon as they touched the cobblestones. Life, he thought, is full of such vanishing gestures, small acts swallowed by time. When he returned to Paris that evening, the city greeted him with a wind that smelled of the river and the smoke of late trams. He crossed the Pont Neuf once more, his eyes lingering on the dark current below. A barge slid silently under the arch, its lanterns bobbing like eyes of some submerged creature. He thought of Bellard's body, of the telegram predicting its place, and felt again the faint unease of standing too close to something that did not belong entirely to reason. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was waiting, sleeves rolled up, his face pale from the long day. "Another letter, Chief," he said, handing it over. "Arrived by post. No return address." Moreau opened it carefully. The handwriting was the same as before, restrained, disciplined, cold. "You have been to Montargis. The clerk spoke truth, but not all of it. There is a second telegram." He looked up sharply. "Was it delivered?" "No record, sir. None in the office, none at the sorting house." Moreau's gaze drifted toward the window, where the city lights trembled in the dark water of the Seine. "Then it's still on its way," he murmured. He locked the letter in his desk drawer and lit his pipe. The smoke rose slowly, curling into shapes that the lamplight could not hold. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint, almost musical clatter of telegraph wires swaying in the storm. He thought again of the words, "The river remembers the hour." And somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder, not whether the message was true, but whether it was addressed to more than one man. The next morning, before dawn, the second telegram arrived. It bore the same Montargis stamp, the same meticulous handwriting. To unknown from unknown. Content: the clocks are not yet right. The operator at the central office swore he found it lying alone on the counter when he came to open the doors. No envelope, no sender, only that cryptic line. When Janvier handed it to him, Moreau simply stared, the fog pressing thick against the window behind him. "The clocks," he whispered, "are never right." And as the bells of Notre Dame tolled the hour, he noticed that his watch too was running 3 minutes slow. There is a certain hour around Les Halles when the market's noise thins to a tired murmur, and the steam on cafe windows turns the world outside into a watercolor of damp coats and bowed heads. It was that hour when Inspector Moreau slipped into the Café des Halles and let the door close softly behind him. The air smelled of boiled coffee, wet wool, and the ghost of onions from the morning's deliveries. A coal stove clicked as it settled. 2 dockmen played cards without speaking, and a woman in a frayed shawl counted coins under the pale globe of a lamp, as if performing a ceremony she had repeated every night of her life. Moreau chose the corner seat facing the window. Through the blurred pane, the rain made rivulets of light that ran downward and vanished at the wood of the sill. He touched his watch, 3 minutes slow still, and did not correct it. He ordered a coffee, and when it came, kept his hands around the cup for the warmth, watching how the steam climbed and dispersed like thought failing to become speech. Somewhere beyond the misted glass, a cart rolled by and the horse snorted, its breath flashing white, then gone. He had not come to this café by chance. An unsigned note left under his office door had said simply, "Where the clocks don't agree, ask for Paul. After the market sleeps." The phrase carried the familiar taunt of the unseen hand that had been pushing this case forward by inches and silences. And so he waited, letting the noise of the room arrange itself into a background upon which a single voice might enter. It did. "Inspector Moreau," said a man sliding into the bench opposite him, as if the seat had been waiting for his weight. He was tall and narrow, with a face that appeared to have been carved downward rather than outward. Long nose, blunt chin, a forehead deep with horizontal lines that implied arithmetic rather than sorrow. His coat was still wet from the rain, but so carefully brushed that the droplets beaded without soaking in. The hat he set down beside him had a brim trained to a precise curve. His eyes, when they lifted to meet Moreau's, were pale enough to seem colourless, like morning light before the day has decided itself. "Paul?" Moreau asked, without offering his hand. "If you like," the man said, half smiling. "Names are only an arrangement of letters. We change them when the hour demands it." The voice was trained, neither provincial nor quite Parisian. It had the deliberate softness of a man accustomed to making people lean forward to hear him. "You sent the note?" "I delivered it." "And the telegrams?" At that, the man's eyes lowered to his own fingertips, which he arranged neatly on the table as if aligning pieces on a board. "Telegrams are instruments. A violin is not a symphony. Still, a violin in the wrong hands can make a room believe in grief." "Speak plainly," Moreau said. His tone did not rise, but the words held the firmness of a door closing. The man's smile thinned, not in offence but in calculation. "There was a pact," he said at last. "2 men and a ledger. One would write what would be, and the other would ensure it had already happened." Bellard? Sometimes he was Bellard. Sometimes he was another. The ledger knows the names. He believed one could fix the future by describing it in a certain order. Like numbers on a page, if they were arranged cleverly enough, the sum could not help but agree. Who was the other? "The hand that lifted the telegraph key," the man murmured. "The hand that slipped a second message where no ledger keeps it. The hand that moves the hour hand forward a minute, only a minute. Men do not notice a minute until the wrong bell rings." "Do you have a name for that hand?" He lifted his pale eyes again. "You once did a favour for him, though you did not know it. A file placed in the wrong cabinet, a testimony that arrived a day later than it might have, changing nothing and everything. He is grateful to you, Inspector. Gratitude is a chain like any other." The stove clicked again. A draught under the door carried in a thin ribbon of cold that ran across the floorboards and climbed the table legs like a cat. Moreau did not move. "You knew Bellard." "I sold him silence first," the man said, almost tenderly. "Then certainty. The silence was inexpensive. It costs little to keep a secret no one is asking for. Certainty is dear. He paid with sleep, then with work, then with the last things a man can give without noticing, his caution, his friends, his instinct to tell himself no. When he was nearly empty, he paid with belief. What did belief buy him? A pattern he could touch. A timetable dressed as destiny. He carried a notebook with a locked clasp. Inside he wrote small, dates, street corners, scraps of weather. Once you teach a frightened man to look for signs, he will find them in the rust on a railing. "Where is the notebook?" The man's fingers lifted from the table and traced a circle on the wet hat brim without looking at it, as if checking the orbit of a planet. "There are houses in the countryside where clocks have lost their names. Ask the caretaker, whose ear was ruined by a bell that fell in winter. He will show you the room where time is punished for running. But be gentle. The clocks frighten easily when they have stopped." The phrase from the unsigned note returned to Moreau with the neatness of a stamp on paper, where the clocks don't agree. He kept his face unreadable. Why did Bellard drown? Because the sentence was written, the man said simply. He lifted his eyes as if watching a slow-moving cloud inside the cafe's lamplight. He was not brave enough to defy ink. Few men are. Once you have measured the hour of your death, every earlier hour becomes a corridor leading to it. He walked where the corridor led. "And you, what did you do at 7 that morning?" The faintest wince crossed the man's face, like a breeze across a candle flame that does not go out. I listened for a bell that did not ring where it should have. It rang somewhere else, 3 minutes away. It was enough. "The ledger," Moreau said. "You spoke of 2 men." "The ledger writes itself when 2 are faithful," he answered. "One predicts, the other performs." The world out of politeness adjusts itself to appear surprised. Moreau let a silence open between them until the stove's ticking became too loud to ignore. Then very softly he said, "You speak like a man who has read many files not meant for him." "Files are like mirrors," the man replied. "They do not change what they hold, only reverse it, so the owner may bear to see it. You, Inspector, are careful what you allow the mirror to show." "Your real name," Moreau said. The man's mouth made a shape that would have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "Names again. I prefer a time. Call me 10:57. It is the minute before the hour declares itself." "A theatrical hour." "All hours are theatrical when you are counting them." At the counter, the woman with the shawl had finished her coins and was staring into the glass, where her reflection was muddy with steam. Somewhere outside, a wagon's wheel struck a loose cobblestone and clattered, the sound skipping like a stone thrown too flat. Moreau became aware of the weight of his pipe in his pocket and did not light it. The smoke would tunnel upward and give away the impatience he did not intend to show. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The man looked almost offended by the question. "Want?" "I am not a creditor, Inspector. I am an hour. I pass through. But I will leave you something to place in your pocket next to the telegrams." He slid a small card across the table. Heavy paper. Clean edges. In the center, a single, tidy line of ink. Rue Cassini, 3rd floor, south-facing room. Ask for the one who measures with shadows, not hands. "An astronomer?" Moreau asked, and though the word was neutral, the man's pupils tightened, the first human sign that something mattered to him. "Once," he said. "Now he is only a man who believes the stars pity us. He will tell you how Bellard learned to keep time by fear. He will also tell you that he warned him. Men who warn are either cowards or saints. It is difficult to tell the difference when the warning is late." "And you?" Moreau said. "What are you?" "A window," he murmured. "You can look through me if you like." But windows cut both ways. Someone is always looking back. He reached for his hat. The brim had dried in the room's warmth and kept its trained curve as if time respected certain obedient lines. "Do not set your watch by the cathedral tomorrow," he added, almost absently. "They will adjust the bell by a minute and deny it. It is a kindness to market women who keep missing their train." He rose. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a sound like fabric torn from the inside. For a moment, standing, he seemed taller, as if the room had been mismeasuring him while he sat. "A last courtesy," he said. "If you go to the house with the stopped clocks, bring someone who does not believe in riddles. Riddles breed in empty houses." "Janvier?" Moreau said, as much to himself as to the man, and the name steadied the air between them. The man's half-smile returned, weary this time. "Not Lucas," he said without looking back, as if that had been the first name to cross Moreau's mind and he had plucked it away. "Lucas is too proud to pretend he cannot hear a bell." He tilted his hat, and for a moment the lamp put a mild halo onto the crown like a schoolboy's trick. Then he walked to the door and pulled it open, letting the street's cold press into the room. The woman with the shawl shivered and did not know why. He disappeared into the fog as if it had been cupped in his hands, waiting to receive him. Moreau did not follow. He sat with the small card under his fingertips until the paper warmed. In the window, a rivulet gathered itself and fell as a clear drop at last, leaving a clean line through the steam. A thin corridor of sight. Through it he could see a street clock across the square. It said 10:15. His watch said 12 minutes to the hour. The clock above the bar, its pendulum slightly lame, knocking rather than swinging, said 8. 3 faces, none agreeing, and yet the cafe did not collapse from the contradiction. People drank, coins changed hands, breath faded in the air. The world continued as though certainty had never been anything but a rumor. He paid, left the change, and stepped out under the narrow awning. The rain had softened to a diligent drizzle that seemed unlikely to cease while anyone was watching. He lifted his collar and began to walk, the card in his pocket like a little weight that belonged to a larger body. Rue Cassini lay to the south, near the observatory's old stones where the city's light learned humility. He would go in the morning. A man who measured with shadows would prefer daylight for his demonstrations. On the way home, he crossed the river and paused at the midpoint of the bridge. The current below was a smooth black mussel. The lamps burned their tired eyes in a row, and the fog turned each one into a halo that did not forgive. He thought of Bellard's notebook with its locked clasp, of the careful letters to the woman in Saint-Aubin, of the operator in Montargis who could not recall a message his ledger had learned to forget. Above him, the bells began to sound the hour, almost in agreement, as if ashamed of their earlier quarrels. He listened and did not count. Counting had become vulgar in the presence of so much measured fear. Back in his apartment, the lamplight accepted his key with a meek flare. He laid the card on the table and looked at it a long time, as if the paper might confess in the manner of men who grow weary of their secrets. From the street rose the diluted song of a night vendor calling roasted chestnuts, a melody that had outlived at least 2 governments and would likely outlive him. He set his watch down and did not wind it, letting the 3 minutes of lateness keep him company in the room like the smallest of conspirators, too trifling to arrest, too loyal to betray. Before sleep, he wrote a single line in his notebook, Rue Cassini, shadows for hands. He closed the cover and let the sentence sit in the dark the way one leaves a coat to drip by the door. Then he lay back and listened to the slow patter on the shutters, counting nothing, asking nothing, making room for the hour that would arrive, whether or not he named it. At dawn the fog moved again, as if someone above the city had drawn a grey cloth back a little. Moreau rose, rinsed the night from his face, and chose a suit with deep pockets. The card waited where he had left it, obedient, as paper must be. When he stepped into the stairwell, the neighbour's radio did not greet him. There were no radios here, not yet, but he heard the faint scrape of a broom and the weary sigh of the building accepting another day. In the courtyard, the fountain was a circle of dark stone with a patient puddle at its heart. He crossed it and turned toward the south, where Rue Cassini would be keeping its appointment. As he reached the boulevard, a newspaper seller thrust a damp sheet under his arm. The headline, in letters rush-cut from sleep, "The Inspector chases tomorrow." He almost laughed, then he didn't. The rain had begun again, the fine, democratic rain that blessed saints and criminals, and men who try to measure both. The street that led to Rue Cassini was lined with bare plane trees whose branches clawed faintly at the pale sky. The observatory dome loomed above them like a dull coin, its brass ribs dimmed by years of Paris weather. Inspector Moreau paused at the gate. A faint smell of coal smoke hung in the air, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of early frost. Somewhere, beyond the wall, a bell chimed the half-hour, slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to name it. The caretaker met him at the entrance, a stooped man in an old waistcoat, his hearing damaged by the years. Moreau remembered the stranger's warning from the café. Ask for the caretaker, whose ear was ruined by a bell that fell in winter. The man's left ear was indeed twisted inward like a scarred leaf. He spoke loudly, as if uncertain of his own voice. "You've come about Monsieur Vautrin, I suppose," he said. "He doesn't receive visitors often, not since the accident with the pendulum." "Accident?" a weight from the clock tower. Dropped right through the floor of the observatory one morning. Nearly killed him. Said it was a sign. He's been measuring shadows ever since. The caretaker led him across a courtyard where dead leaves had gathered in wet spirals. The stones still bore the outlines of old foundations, observatory outbuildings dismantled after the war. It was a place that seemed to exist slightly outside time, where the air itself had the patience of an archivist. They entered through a narrow door. The smell changed. Chalk dust, lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of mould. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through high windows where frost had formed delicate maps. Instruments stood about like strange skeletons, a broken telescope, a table scattered with glass slides, a long pendulum cord frayed at the end where the weight had fallen. At the far end of the room, a man bent over a desk, his face hidden behind the flare of a lamp. When he turned, the light caught the edge of his spectacles, revealing a lined, intelligent face and the distracted air of one who lives in conversation with silence. "Monsieur Vautrin?" Moreau said. The man looked up slowly. "Inspector Moreau. I wondered when you would come." "You expected me?" "I expected someone. These things follow a rhythm. I heard of Billard's death. It was only a matter of time before the questions came home." "Home?" Vautrin gestured to the walls. "He spent months here, working beside me. He called it research, but it was devotion. He believed that every event cast two shadows, one before and one after. He thought the future was merely a shadow arriving early." Moreau moved closer to the desk. There were notebooks piled in careful disorder, their pages dense with equations and sketches of clock faces intersected by arcs. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. "He came to you for science, then?" Moreau said. "For certainty," Vautrin corrected. "He wanted the universe to confirm his fears. I tried to dissuade him, told him that mathematics cannot soothe the soul of a man who has already chosen his hour. But he would not listen. He said he had received proof from Montargis, of all places." "The telegram." Vautrin nodded. "He showed it to me, trembling with excitement. He said it was validation, that his calculations had crossed from theory into life. But I saw something else in his eyes, relief, as though the knowledge of his death had lifted from him the burden of doubt. You see, Inspector, belief can comfort even when it kills." He rose and crossed to a tall cabinet. From within he withdrew a small black notebook bound with a clasp of tarnished brass. "He left this here, said I was to return it to no one. But perhaps you will make better use of it than I can." Moreau took it gently. The cover was smooth with handling. When he opened it, the scent of old paper rose like a whisper. The pages were filled with lists, names, dates, cryptic lines written in a tight, controlled hand. Some entries were crossed out with deliberate strokes, others circled. And there, toward the end, he saw a date that had not yet come. Next Thursday. Followed by a single word, Inspector. He closed the book. "Did you see him the day he died?" "No, he left without a word. Only this note." Vautrin reached into his coat and unfolded a scrap of paper. He wrote, "The clocks are not yet right, but soon they will be. When they are, I will be free. I thought it meant nothing, but now perhaps it meant everything." Moreau slipped the notebook into his pocket. "You said he measured shadows. What did that mean?" Vautrin smiled faintly. "Ah, a poetic phrase for a practical method. He built a device, a dial that used reflected light to compare solar time with local time. But the strange thing, Inspector, is that it was always off by 3 minutes. No matter how he corrected it, the shadow refused to obey the clock. He grew obsessed, claimed the universe was mocking him, that the deviation was proof of something hidden, a discrepancy between the world and its reflection. 3 minutes, Moreau repeated. Yes. The same discrepancy you've begun to notice, I imagine. Clocks that disagree, bells that ring too soon or too late. He called it the drift. He said it would spread. that the city would soon find itself a few minutes ahead of its fate. Outside, the wind rattled the panes and the sound of a loose shutter echoed like a faint heartbeat. Moreau felt the chill crawl beneath his collar. "And you?" he asked. "Do you believe it?" Vautrin sighed. "I believe in men who believe. It is a contagion." I spent long enough in his company that I, too, began to listen for the bell before it struck. When he died, I told myself it was coincidence. But sometimes in the half hour before dawn, I swear the pendulum still swings. He turned back to his desk, his voice softening. "You're not the first to follow his trail, you know. There was another, a tall man, precise in manner, foreign in his tailoring. He asked about the notebook as well. When I refused him, he smiled and said, 'Then the inspector will find it.'" Moreau's jaw tightened. "Paul?" Vautrin looked puzzled. "He gave no name, only an hour, 10:57. Moreau exhaled slowly. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if time itself had thickened. He thanked the professor and left, the notebook burning cold against his chest. Outside, the sky had turned a deep grey blue, the colour of tarnished silver. From somewhere across the courtyard came the sound of a hammer striking metal. Once, twice, the echo carrying like the heartbeat of a clock too large to see. He paused at the gate and looked back at the observatory dome. In one of the upper windows, a faint light flickered, then went out. On the walk back toward the river, he stopped at a public clock above a tobacconist's sign. It showed 5 minutes past 5. His watch read 2 past. A tram clattered by, its driver glancing at the same clock before releasing the brake, as though awaiting permission from an authority no one had named. By the time he reached his office, darkness had settled over the city. The lamps along the Seine glowed through the fog like embers in a dying fire. He poured himself a measure of brandy and opened the notebook again under the desk lamp. The entries swam before his eyes, a language of time he could almost read, but not quite translate. He ran his finger over the final date, the one that bore his name, and for the first time in years felt the slow, deliberate weight of fear. He closed the book and reached for the telegrams, spreading them across the desk. The first predicting Bellard's death, the second warning of the widow's lie, the third speaking of clocks. They seemed to form a pattern, like coordinates leading toward a place not yet reached. He laid his pocket watch among them. The second hand ticked with ruthless precision, the faintest delay in its rhythm barely perceptible, and yet, when the bells outside struck 6, the watch insisted it was 3 minutes earlier. He sat back, the sound of the bells dissolving into the night beyond the window. Somewhere in the city, a telegraph key clicked once, a soft metallic syllable, too quick for meaning, too late for chance. By the next morning, Paris had transformed the mystery into a spectacle. The kiosks at every corner carried the same headline, their black type shouting through the mist, "The Man Who Knew the Future." Police inquiry at the observatory. Beneath it, the subheadings grew more extravagant with each edition. Scientific hoax or occult miracle? And did the dead predict their own murder? The ink smelled sharp and new, like something still cooling from the press, and the city inhaled it greedily. Moreau watched from the cafe across the street as men unfolded their papers, women whispered behind their gloves, and a newsboy shouted the story's title as if he were selling prophecy itself. He stirred his coffee without tasting it. Each headline, each rumor, tugged the case further from his hands. The city was no longer reading about a man named André Bellard. It was reading about fate, and fate was notoriously difficult to interrogate. Janvier arrived, rain on his hat brim, and dropped into the seat opposite him. "You've seen it, Chief. They're calling it the prophecy case. Half the city believes the devil's opened a telegraph office." "Half the city believes worse things," Moreau said quietly. "What do we have?" "Letters, telegrams, phone calls, the whole menagerie. Everyone claims to have known Bellard or seen him predict something. One man swears Bellard told him the price of coal would fall before Easter. Another says he was promised a message from the afterlife within the week. And look at this. He handed over a thin envelope. Inside was a clipping from a provincial paper dated the previous month. Montage's mystery figure returns. Unknown man seen at telegraph office nightly. Beneath the line was a blurred photograph of a tall figure crossing the square under a lamplight, face indistinct, posture unmistakably deliberate. 10:57, Moreau murmured. Janvier frowned. You think he's behind all of it? I think he's the conductor. Bellard was only an instrument. The younger man leaned forward. There's more. A woman called last night, claimed she was Bellard's cousin. She said he'd joined a group before his death, people who believed they could map time. They called themselves les veilleurs, the watchers. The watchers, Moreau repeated. The name had the rhythm of an old superstition, the kind whispered between dock workers and laundresses, given weight by fear alone. She said they met in a house outside the city, claimed Bellard wasn't the first to die after a prediction. 2 others, one in Lyon, one near Reims, both drowned. Both had received telegrams foretelling it. Moreau rubbed his temple. Did she give an address? No, only a phrase. The house where the clock stopped. He looked up sharply. That phrase again. Janvier nodded. I thought it sounded familiar. Moreau's thoughts drifted to the notebook in his drawer, the neat handwriting, the dates that felt more like instructions than records, the final entry marked with his name. He had not told Janvier about that page. Some things felt heavier when spoken aloud. The waiter approached, but neither man acknowledged him. Outside, the rain thickened into a steady curtain, and the cafe windows began to fog. Through the blur, Moreau could see the pale reflection of his own face, lined, weary, marked by sleeplessness, and behind it, the blurred city that was already rewriting his investigation as myth. Chief, Janvier said after a pause, why do you think people believe so quickly? Even the educated ones. A man receives a telegram, drowns in a river, and suddenly it's destiny instead of murder. Moreau smiled faintly, though the expression held no joy. Because belief is easier than doubt. Doubt demands work, Thomas, and the city's too tired for work. He finished his coffee, left coins on the table, and stood. Find out what you can about this group, the Watchers. Quietly. We'll meet at the station before dusk. As he stepped out into the street, the bells of Saint-Eustache began to toll the hour. He glanced at the nearest clock. 2 minutes, slow. Another discrepancy. Another small betrayal in the machinery of time. By afternoon, the Quai des Orfèvres was thick with the smell of damp coats and gossip. Clerks whispered as he passed. One of them had pinned a cartoon to the notice board, a drawing of a man drowning while staring at a pocket watch labelled The Future. Moreau tore it down without comment. In his office, the pile of correspondence had doubled. He skimmed the letters quickly, spiritualists offering assistance, scientists proposing theories, anonymous notes written in red ink warning him to stop interfering with the pattern. Among them lay one telegram, its paper thin and grey, the handwriting painfully familiar. To Inspector Moreau, Paris, from unknown, Montage's content. You are writing the story too slowly. He stared at it for a long time. The absurdity almost made him laugh. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer beside Bellard's notebook. The two felt like matching pieces of a puzzle whose picture had not yet been printed. As dusk fell, the sky bruised into a deep violet. Moreau walked along the river, collar up, the cobblestones gleaming with rain. The Seine carried fragments of light between its black ripples, and he could almost believe the city was breathing through the water itself. He paused beneath the bridge, the same place where Bellard had been found. The police tape was gone now, only the memory remained, floating like a shadow beneath the surface. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke unravel, thinking of Bellard's notebook, the predictions, the measured handwriting, the calm certainty of a man who had arranged his own death like an appointment. But what if it wasn't certainty? What if it was coercion? Behind him, a voice spoke softly. "You've been promoted to author now, I see." Moreau turned. The man from the cafe stood there, hat tilted, eyes faintly luminous in the lamplight. The fog had caught in his coat like frost. "The papers are quoting you," he said. "Inspector Moreau, the skeptic, chasing prophecy. I read it this morning while waiting for the next edition. You've become part of the story." "I never asked to be." "Stories rarely ask permission." He smiled faintly. "Do you know why the newspapers write so fast, Inspector? Because they're afraid of silence. Silence makes people listen to their own clocks, and no one likes what they hear." Moreau's jaw tightened. "Why the letters? The telegrams? What do you gain from all this?" "Gain?" The man tilted his head as though the word were foreign. "You speak like an accountant. I am merely a custodian. I keep the hours tidy. Sometimes they overlap. An inconvenience, but nothing fatal unless you look too closely." "And Bellard?" "He looked too closely. You're beginning to." The man stepped nearer. "Tell me, have you checked the time since we last met?" Moreau's hand moved instinctively to his pocket. His watch showed 8:43. "The bells rang 8:46, the man said. "You see? Even you are drifting." He tipped his hat, and before Moreau could reply, he was gone, swallowed by the fog and the steady hiss of rain. The inspector stood alone beneath the bridge, the echo of the man's words clinging to the air. He lifted his watch once more, listening to its faint ticking. For the first time, he thought he heard something between the beats. Not silence, but another rhythm running just out of sync, like a second pulse hidden behind his own. That night, the newspapers printed a new headline, "Police Investigator, Warned by Unknown Source." "The clocks are not yet right." The city read it by lamplight and shivered, not because it understood, but because the hour on the printed page seemed suddenly unfamiliar to them all. The road out of Paris ran like a black ribbon through pale fields, the harvest already taken, the stubble shining with frost as if the earth had grown a beard overnight. Janvier drove because Moreau preferred to smoke and think, the window cracked enough to let the cold tamp the tobacco's sweetness into something more honest. Dawn had not decided itself. The horizon was the color of a bruise beginning to heal. They spoke little. The city fell behind them with a last flutter of newspapers at a kiosk, and then there were only hedgerows, ditches still holding the memory of last week's rain, and the occasional cottage with a thin thread of smoke that rose straight up and vanished into the grey. Janvier had packed a satchel, as if for a modest campaign. Lamp oil, matches, sealing wax, twine, a small crowbar wrapped in sacking so it would not glint. He had tucked a revolver in beside them with a look that asked no permission. "We'll be poking where men don't like visitors, Chief," he'd said. Moreau had not argued. The address had come by way of 3 rumors, a cousin's tremble on the telephone, and a phrase that would not stop repeating itself in his head. The house where the clock stopped. They left the road for a narrow lane that pretended to be a path only out of politeness. The hedges leaned together in a quiet conspiracy, and the ruts filled with last night's water. Somewhere a dog barked without seeing them, and then thought better of it. They found the house at a turn that felt more like a decision than a corner. A low, rectangular building of stone the color of old coins, its shutters half-closed, like the eyelids of a dozing animal that was only pretending to sleep. Ivy had taken the walls with a patient hand. The gate hung by a single hinge, and creaked not at all when Janvier lifted it aside, which seemed worse than if it had protested. "Charming," Janvier said, not meaning it. "It will be if it lets us leave," Moreau answered. The front door was locked, but the lock was tired. Janvier eased the wrapped crowbar into the seam and gave the smallest of pushes. The wood sighed, then yielded, as if it had been waiting for a decisive man to arrive. The entry smelled of dry plaster and apples once stored, and now only remembered. Dust lay everywhere, like paper ash. The first room held chairs with their backs to the wall as if punished, a long table where someone had once measured cloth, and a tiled stove, cold as a kept secret. They found the clocks in the next room, not one or two, but dozens, hanging from the walls and lined along shelves, carriage clocks in gilt and brass, wooden cuckoos with painted leaves, sober regulators with faces the size of dinner plates, a grand case whose pendulum had stilled in mid-swing like a thought interrupted. Each had been stopped by a careful hand. A few showed 1/4 past some hour, others 12 precisely, and several, too many, sat with their hands at 3 minutes to the hour, as if arrested on the lip of announcement. The silence was a texture, a thing you could have picked up between finger and thumb. Janvier lifted his hat as if he had entered a chapel. "Who lives here?" he whispered, and then flushed at his own voice. "No one," Moreau said, "or everyone who asked to stop hearing the bell." On a sideboard lay a scattering of things that had once been pockets: ticket stubs, a leather strap, a handful of coins from different years, a broken spectacle lens that held a small, localized world of upside-down walls. On a chair back hung a coat that smelled faintly of lamp oil and stale tobacco. No cobwebs had claimed it. The house might have been visited last night by someone skilled at not being seen. They moved as one does in museum rooms, careful not to touch unless touching is the point. Moreau lit their lamp and turned the wick until the flame settled into a patient glow. He studied the faces of the clocks, the hairline cracks in enamel, the polite Roman numerals that promised order and then betrayed it. He thought of Vautrin's dial that refused to agree, of 1057's voice saying, "Names are only arrangements of letters and hours are their pronunciation." "There," Janvier said softly, pointing to the grand case clock. Its glass was dusty except for a clear oval where a face had been pressed recently. The keyhole below the dial was too clean. Janvier crouched, peered inside, then looked up. "Something's tucked behind the weight." Moreau steadied the case while Janvier eased the front open and reached in past the brass cylinder. His fingers emerged with an object wrapped in waxed paper and tied with string. He set it on the table, and together they listened to the strangeness of their own breathing as if it belonged to someone hiding in the next room. Moreau cut the string with his penknife, unfolded the paper, and revealed a notebook the size of a wallet, bound in black calf. A brass clasp had been scored with a file, so it would open without its proper key. The first page was a neat grid of dates and places. Not Bellard's hand. This script leaned forward slightly, impatient, a little vain. Each entry paired a location with a time, and each time with a small symbol, a circle, a dash, an asterisk. At the bottom of the page, a legend waited, smug with its own precision: circle for announcement, dash for witness, asterisk for correction. Janvier swore softly. "The ledger," Moreau said. They turned pages. Here were the predictions as acts to be mounted. Café table reserved, clerk distracted at 6, ledger turned to the wrong page by a borrowed hand, a barge passing under Pont Neuf at the moment a man sits, a telegram placed where an operator will find it just late enough to make it seem early. It was stagecraft. Clean, cruel stagecraft, the kind that relies not on miracles, but on the laziness of habit and the kindness of strangers who do not realize they have been cast. "What do you call a man who writes the future this way?" Janvier asked. "Hungry," Moreau said. He kept turning until the script reached the present week. The paper thinned, the entries grew tense, the letters pressed deeper, as if the pen had bitten with its teeth. And then, on a page that looked as though someone had touched it too often, they found the next Thursday that had haunted both of them since Vautrin's notebook. A clean line, an hour underlined twice, and a name written without ornament. Inspector. After it, the small circle of announcement, and then, he felt it like a hand on the back of his neck, the asterisk for correction. Janvier looked up. What is to be corrected? Moreau did not answer. He felt, suddenly, the admirable logic of certain suicides, the neatness of choosing a door before a hallway, the economy of ending a story before it embarrasses itself. He shut the book, held it a moment, and opened it again, this time looking for what had not been meant for eyes. At the back, under the paste, a thin rectangle resisted his thumb. He slipped the knife along the binding and lifted a cache of small, precise photographs, street corners, doorways, the dark rectangle under Pont-Neuf taken from a distance that made men into a kind of punctuation. On the reverse of each, a time noted to the minute. On two, a second time written later, 3 minutes different. The drift, Janvier said. What men will do with 3 minutes? Moreau murmured. What they will swear, what they will deny. He spread the photographs in a tidy fan. At the bottom lay a final card, heavier than the rest, its corners rounded as if it had ridden a long time in a wallet. Written in the same impatient hand, it offered a sentence without address. When the clocks are reconciled, the story will pay its debt. He turned it over and felt the paper cool his fingers. Someone, Bellard or his partner, believed that mercy and arithmetic could be reconciled by the right arrangement of hours. They explored the rest of the house with the lamp held high. In a cupboard, they found bundles of telegram blanks that had been pilfered from provincial offices, their stamps authentic, their numbers absent. In a drawer, 3 different operators' rubber seals, worn around, the edges by the impersonation of authority. In the bread box of all places, a handful of keys and a watchmaker's loop that magnified the world into something almost kind. On a sill, a pencil shaved to its last stubborn inch. None of it miraculous, all of it enough. In the back room stood a narrow bed with a blanket folded at its foot and a patched shirt drying on a line that had never known sunshine. On the wall above the bed, someone had drawn a line in pencil from floor to ceiling and marked it in small, careful increments, notches for minutes, tiny crosses for hours. Beside 3 marks a word in the impatient hand, missed, corrected, paid. Who sleeps here? Janvier asked. The man who calls himself by a time, Moreau said. He could see him suddenly, the long face bent over the tidy ledger, the coat held righteous by a careful brush, the fingers arranging themselves on a table as if aligning the planets. He could smell the hunger that had nothing to do with bread. He felt a naked shame for ever having thought of fate without considering the man holding the key to the back of the clock. A small noise turned both their heads, the slightest rap at the window pane from the courtyard, like a leaf deciding whether to go on living. Moreau crossed, lifted the latch, and stepped into air that had grown thin and sharp as a blade. The yard was enclosed by walls that had learned to keep their counsel. Against one wall, a shed leaned like a drunk, explaining himself. Inside it, they found crates of clock guts, gears, escapements, springs coiled like slept-with snakes, labelled by diameter and eagerness. In the corner, a crate of stones from the river weighed down a sheet of newspapers gone fragile. The top page showed last year's headline about a flood that had spared the markets and drowned 2 vagabonds who did not know the right doorway for mercy. A circle had been drawn in pencil around the print of Notre Dame's bells. Janvier set his jaw. He's been rehearsing for years. Until the rehearsal became the play, Moreau said. They carried the ledger and the photographs back to the clockroom and set them on the table. Something in the house had shifted, not physically but in stance, as if it had decided they were not thieves but auditors come too late. The lamp burned cleanly. A moth visited and then left, unimpressed by human arrangements. "What now?" Janvier asked. "Now we pay attention to the smallest things," Moreau said. To which clock in the station reads the train? To which bell in the quarter refuses to be taught good manners? We must find where he plans to reconcile his minutes. He touched the page that bore his name without touching it, and we must ask whether the debt is meant to be mine. They sealed the notebook in paper and twine and slipped it into the satchel between lamp oil and revolver. Janvier locked the front door out of habit and then remembered, with a wry line at his mouth, that a locked door had never saved anyone who expected to come back. They stepped into the lane. The hedges were darker now. The morning had decided to be a day after all. A cart rattled somewhere unseen, and the call of a crow proved that not all prophets were men. On the road, the car's engine caught after a sulk, and then agreed to cooperate. The house watched them leave with the expression of an old dog that has loved too much to learn new tricks. When the lane widened to road, Moreau looked once over his shoulder. Through the open shutter of the clock room, a face of enamel shone in the lamp's last light, its hands at 3 minutes to an hour he chose not to name. He did not wind his watch. He kept it in his pocket like a sleeping mouse and let the bells of the countryside tell him what they believed. In the reflection of the windscreen, the small line of his mouth softened, then set. He thought of Vautrin among the chalk and pendulums, of the widow who had not yet lied and had already lied, of 1057's pale eyes and the way the city itself had begun to breathe in time with someone else's pulse. By the time the first roofs of Paris lifted themselves out of the fields, a decision had formed with the stubbornness of a song you cannot forget. If the ledger wanted an hour named, he would name it himself. If there was to be a correction, he would decide where the asterisk belonged. The river would remember its hour, perhaps, but he would be there when it tried to speak. He touched the satchel between his boots, feeling the square presence of the book through the canvas. It was only paper, and yet it weighed like a metal kept in the body between one heartbeat and the next. He looked at Janvier and saw in the younger man's profile not obedience, but a care that was clean and not sentimental. He nodded once. Janvier nodded back without taking his eyes from the road. They entered the city at the hour when shops yawn and shutters slide back like eyelids returning to duty. The lamps along the Seine burned without apology. The water below moved like a thought a man cannot stop having. Moreau felt at his chest for the comfort of his notebook and found, to his surprise, that his hand was steady. The bells began to gather themselves, the way animals gather before a sudden weather. Somewhere a key turned in a door that meant nothing, and somewhere a woman placed a cup where a man would find it and mistake it for luck. The ledger in the satchel was quiet. The clocks on the walls they had left were quiet. The city, which had learned to survive all its prophecies, took a breath. "Tomorrow," Moreau said, though no one had asked him anything. "Tomorrow we will be early." Morning came with a clarity that felt almost staged, as though Paris had scrubbed its own sky for the sake of what was to happen. The fog had lifted overnight, leaving the air brittle with cold, the rooftops sharp against a pale blue that refused softness. The bells of Notre Dame struck 8 with such precision that even the sparrows paused before descending onto the market stalls below. It was a city holding its breath, and Inspector Moreau felt it the moment he stepped out into the street. He walked without haste. The satchel was slung over his shoulder, the ledger within shifting with each step, like a second heartbeat. Janvier trailed a few paces behind, quiet as a shadow, his jaw set with a tension he did not bother to hide. They crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, its stone balustrade still slick from the night's frost, and the river below coiled like a dark thought held close. By the time they reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the prefecture was already buzzing. Clerks darted from room to room carrying reports that now seemed irrelevant. A journalist waited outside the gates, shivering beneath his scarf, eyes bright with the hope of a headline. Moreau ignored him. He had no answers to give that would satisfy the appetite of a city grasping for myth. Inside his office, the clock on the wall read 8:27. His pocket watch agreed. Every clock in the building had been corrected overnight, a detail he had not ordered, but someone had taken the initiative. He set the satchel on the desk and eased the notebook out, the ledger of futures, predictions that looked inevitable only because someone had made them so. He spread it open to the page marked Thursday. There was his name again, his hour, no address, no location, only the time. He looked up at Janvier. "We stay ahead of him," he said. "We refuse the narrative." Janvier nodded. "Where do we start?" "Where he least expects us. He's built this like a stage. We don't enter through the audience doors." They went first to the telegraph office on Rue du Bac, the place most likely to receive a final message from Montargis or somewhere worse. The operator, a timid man with ink-stained cuffs, blanched at the sight of them. "Nothing has come for you, Inspector," he said. "But we were told to expect—" "By whom?" "The tall man, the one with the quiet voice." Moreau felt no surprise. "If a telegram arrives, you will not deliver it. You will lock it in your drawer until I return." From there, they walked the city in a deliberate spiral. The bridge where Bellard had died, the café where 1057 had spoken in riddles, the clock tower near the observatory, its bell repaired, but its chime still a fraction too soon. The city revealed itself slowly, like a map turned by an unseen hand. In each place they found no sign of the man, no trace of the promised hour. But in each place they found the same thing, clocks that did not agree. Shop clocks, tram clocks, clocks in cafes and public squares. Each one slightly off, as if time itself were rehearsing for some grand alignment. By midday they reached the river once more. The lamps along the quay were unlit, though the sun had lost none of its cold. Moreau paused beside the railing and stared into the water. The Seine reflected nothing but sky. Yet he thought of the phrase, "The river remembers the hour." It had not felt like a threat. It had felt like a summons. "What are we missing?" Janvier asked quietly. Moreau closed the notebook and placed it beneath his arm. "We're following his path. We need to make our own." He turned and began walking toward the Ile de la Cité, toward the heart of the city, where the oldest streets kept their own counsel. Past the cathedral, past the low stone archways, past the shuttered stall of a bookseller who had not yet returned from his illness. And then, at the corner of Rue de la Colombe, they found it. A small wooden box fixed to the wall, its glass face cracked, its hands frozen at 2:57. 3 minutes to the hour, his hour. Moreau stepped closer. The box was not a clock at all, but a message board. Inside lay an envelope, sealed with green wax. No name, no address. Only the impression of a circle, a mark used in the ledger to denote announcement. He broke the seal. Inside was a card, on it a single line, written in the same measured hand. "When the clocks agree, you will know what was corrected." Below it, another line added in smaller script. "Or you may refuse the hour. The river is patient." Moreau felt something in his chest constrict. Not fear, but a tightening of thought, a sudden clarity that came like cold water over the face. The ledger had not marked a place because the place was not fixed. The only fixed element was the hour. The rest had been left to chance, or to him. "He's watching," Janvier said. "No," Moreau replied. "He's counting." He looked at his pocket watch. It read 2:49, 12 minutes. He felt no pull toward any location, no sense of an appointed place except the one the man had tried to force upon him. He snapped the watch shut and looked up at the sky. "We go to the bridge," he said. Janvier hesitated. "Chief, that's where he expects us. So we refuse him. We walk. We stay in motion. We let the hour find nothing but an empty chair." They walked not toward the river, but away from it, into a warren of narrow streets that wound between shops and courtyards. Moreau's steps were even, his breath steady. He felt the strange calm of a man who has finally understood that the answer to a riddle is silence. Time, he thought, is only a threat when you obey it. At 2:57, the bells of Saint-Séverin began to ring. A slow, solemn toll. Moreau did not stop. He and Janvier kept walking, their shadows long in the slanted winter light. 1, 2, 3 chimes. And then the bells of the cathedral joined in, their deeper voice drowning the smaller bell as though correcting its tone. At 3 there was no thunderbolt, no telegram, no vision of the future. Only the city breathing in time with itself again. The clocks had agreed, the hour had passed, and nothing had been corrected, except perhaps the humility of a man who had believed he could arrange the world by minutes alone. They stopped at the edge of Place Dauphine, where children were playing with sticks and autumn leaves. The world, indifferent, carried on. Moreau let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The river, unseen beyond the houses, moved in its ancient rhythm, remembering nothing of hours. Janvier turned to him. "It's over?" "For him," Moreau said, "not for us." He reached into the satchel and drew out the ledger. Without opening it, he walked to the fountain at the square's centre, its basin dry for the season. He set the book on the stone lip, lit a match, and held it to the edge of the cover. The flame caught slowly, then eagerly, as if the paper had been waiting all along to surrender. The ink curled, and the predictions dissolved into ash. When the last page had crumbled, he closed his hand around the char and let the wind take it. A black feather of burnt paper drifted upward, then disappeared. He turned to Janvier. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll set the clocks right again, but only because they've earned it." The younger man smiled, a tired smile that held no triumph, only relief. They walked back toward the precinct, leaving no footprints on the stones that would not be washed away by the next rain. The bells of the city, having fulfilled their duty, rested in their towers. The world had not ended. It had only been corrected by indifference. That night, in his room on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, Moreau did not wind his watch. He left it on the table, letting it stop in its sleep. Time, after all, owed him no promises. The wind outside rattled the shutters once, then fell still. And the city, still unconcerned with prophecy, dreamed the ordinary dreams of those who never suspect they have been spared.